The hall was big, bigger than any building on Earth. The ceiling went so high that clouds formed near the top. The walls were made of something that looked like glass but was harder than stone. Thousands of seats filled the space, and in almost every seat sat creature that was not human. There were tall ones with 4 arms. There were short ones with no eyes but 3 mouths. There were ones that floated in tanks of thick green liquid and spoke through machines. There were ones that looked like trees, slow and ancient and cold. 47 species, 47 civilizations, all of them gathered in one place, all of them staring at one woman. Her name was HFY. She was the last human ambassador to the galactic conclave. She stood at the center of the great floor alone in a simple dark uniform. No weapons, no guards. She carried only a small folder of papers that no one would ever read. Her face was calm. Her hands were still. The Valari Archon spoke first. The Valari were the oldest species in the conclave. They had been traveling the stars for 60,000 years. When they spoke, every other species listened. The Archon's voice came through the translation system as a low, smooth sound, like wind moving through stone halls. He said that humanity had caused enough damage. He said the Cathara incident had cost lives across 12 systems. He said that humanity was too young, too angry, too dangerous to sit among civilized beings. He said the vote had already been taken. The result was clear: 47 votes, 47 against humanity. The Quarantine Accord was now law. Earth and its 7 colonies would be cut off. No faster than light travel lanes would connect to human space. No trade ships would come. No communication would be allowed in or out. No human would be permitted to leave their systems. No human voice would be heard in the conclave again. They expected a Shah raised to argue. They expected her to cry or shout or beg. Some of the species watched her with what might have been curiosity. Some watched with something that looked like pity. The Cathara delegation watched with open satisfaction. Their long segmented bodies shifted and clicked quietly among themselves. Ashari did not argue. She did not cry. She looked around the room slowly, her dark eyes moving from species to species, face to face. She did not look angry. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had just been given a very important piece of information and was filing it carefully away for later. Then she nodded once. She picked up her folder. She turned around. She walked out of the hall. Without a single word, the doors closed behind her with a sound like the end of something back on Earth. The broadcast went out within the hour. Every screen, every device, every public system carried the same message at the same time. It was not a speech from a president or a general. It was a simple statement read in a calm voice, translated into every human language. It said, "The galactic conclave has closed the door to humanity. We will not knock again. We will build our own." That was all. No call to war, no tears, no long explanation. Just those 2 sentences. And then silence. People stood in streets and listened. Workers stopped in factories. Children stopped in schools. Farmers stood in their fields under alien suns on colony worlds and heard the words and looked up at the sky. Some people cried. Some people were angry. Some people sat down and stared at nothing for a long time. But most people after a while got back to work because that was what the Message was really saying, not that everything was over, but that everything was just beginning. The 7 colonies were Tarsi's, Velt, Marith, Siren, Dusk, Point New Kavala, and the one simply called the Rock. Each one was different. Tarsi's was warm and green, Velt was cold and windy. The Rock was exactly what it sounded like. But they were all human, and they all heard the same message, and they all understood it the same way. We are alone now, so we had better be. Enough. The conclave placed sensor buoys at the edge of human space. They were meant to watch for any attempt to leave, and to make sure no one entered. The buoys sent their signals back to conclave stations every few hours. For the first several years, the signals were ordinary human ships moving between colonies, energy readings from cities and farms, the normal quiet noise of a civilization that was being very careful not to draw attention. Then, slowly the signals started to change. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once. Just small things, a new type of energy reading here, a frequency that didn't match any known human technology there. The analysts at the conclave stations logged the changes and sent reports. The reports went to senior stations and then to the conclave councils, where they sat in queues with thousands of other reports about thousands of other worlds. Nobody read them closely. Why would they? Humanity was finished. Humanity was contained. The Cathara had been pushing for the quarantine for 30 years, and now they had it. The old problem was solved. There were newer, more interesting problems to deal with. And besides, what could humans possibly do? They were one species. They had 7 colonies. They had no allies, no trade, no resources from outside their own small bubble of space. They were like a fire that had been sealed in a box without air. Fires die. That was what the conclave believed. That was the first and most important mistake they would ever make, because humans were not a fire sealed in a box. They were the kind of people who, when locked in a box, started figuring out how to make the box bigger, and then how to make a better box, and then how to build something that didn't need a box at all. Asha lived for 30 more years after the day she walked out of that hall. She never spoke publicly about what happened, but she worked every day. She wrote, she taught, she helped plan, and before she died, she left behind one short sentence that would become the foundation of everything that followed. She wrote, "They gave us time. Do not waste a second of it." The years passed. Then the decades, the first 30 years, were the hardest. Without outside trade, some of the colonies ran short on certain materials. Tarse lost a lot of its heavy manufacturing for almost a decade. Velt had food shortages for 2 years. The Rock had it worst. It had always depended on imports for almost everything, and now there were no imports. The people of the Rock had to learn very quickly how to grow food in cold stone caves under artificial lights. They learned. That was the thing about the hard years. People learned. They had no choice but to learn, so they did. And when you learn something the hard way, under real pressure with real consequences, you learn it deeply. You learn it in a way that stays. By the time 30 years had passed, the 7 colonies were not suffering. They were not comfortable, not yet. But they were standing, and they were starting to look up. The scientists were the ones who moved fastest, cut off from the conclave's vast libraries of shared knowledge. Human researchers had to start from scratch on many problems, but starting from scratch sometimes means You find paths that no one else has. Walked, you ask questions that no one else thought to ask because no one told you the answer was already known. In year 31, a team of 4 physicists on Moreth figured out how to pull energy from the space between atoms, not nuclear energy, not solar something deeper than both. They called it zero-point extraction, and it worked, not perfectly at first. The first machine was the size of a building and powered only a small town, but it worked. Within 15 years, the machines were the size of a car and powered a city. Within 40 years, they were the size of a fist and powered a colony. Energy stopped being a problem forever. With unlimited energy, everything else became possible. Ships could travel faster, factories could run longer, farms under artificial light could grow anything anywhere. Colonies grew, new ones were founded. Not just 7 anymore, then 12, then 20, then 40. The conclave buoys watched and reported. The readings were strange. The energy signatures didn't match anything in the known catalog. The new colonies appeared in systems that the conclave had mapped but never bothered to develop because they were too far, too difficult, too expensive to reach. For humans with their new engines and unlimited power, they were just neighbors. The reports kept coming. Conclave councils kept filing them away. The second great change came in year 75. It wasn't a technology, it was an idea. A philosophy written by a historian named David Osk on the colony of Siren. He called it the Rays Doctrine, named after the ambassador who had walked away in silence. The doctrine was simple. It said that humanity's goal was not to impress the galaxy, not to rejoin the conclave, not to prove anything to anyone. The goal was to build something so complete, so strong, and so good that the galaxy would eventually have to acknowledge it on humanity's terms. Alone, we do not ask permission. Oe wrote, we earn irrelevance. It became a motto. It was printed on school walls and carved above the doors of research buildings. Children grew up hearing it. It shaped the way people thought about their work. Not anger, not ambition for power, just quiet, relentless building. By year 120, humanity had settled more than 40 star systems. None of them were in conclave territory. They were in the space beyond the mapped edges, in the places no other species had bothered to go. Humans called it the uncharted reach. It was vast, it was rich, and it was entirely there. The old colonies became cities. The new systems became colonies. Everything grew. Roads between stars, stations the size of small moons, schools that taught children born in one star system to talk easily with children born in another. In year 180, a young engineer named Scion Park on New Kavala solved a problem that had stopped every known species in the galaxy cold. She figured out how to make ships that built other ships, not just automated factories, but true recursive construction. One ship could produce 10. 10 could produce a 100. 100 could produce 1,000. The fleet could grow faster than any enemy could count. She was 26 years old when she solved it. She became the most important person in human history that almost no one outside human space would ever hear of. Year 240 brought the last great piece. A small team of researchers had been working for 60 years on a single problem. The conclave's FTL system used a network of lanes built and maintained by the oldest species, controlled and taxed by the conclave itself. Humanity had no access to those lanes, so the team had been trying to find another way. They found it. They called it fold space compression. It had nothing to do with the lane network. It bent space itself. Briefly, like folding a piece of paper to bring two distant points together. You could go anywhere instantly without asking anyone for permission, without paying anyone a toll, without using a single lane that the conclave controlled. The first test jumped a ship from one end of human space to the other. In less than a second, the crew on board said they felt nothing, just one moment. They were here and the next they were there. In year 249, humanity went silent. Every signal stopped. Every frequency went dark. No transmissions, no noise, just nothing. The conclave buoys at the border reported total silence from human space and sent their reports. The analysts noted that the silence was unusual but not alarming. Some suggested humanity had finally collapsed. Most didn't think about it at all. 1 year later, everything changed. The message arrived everywhere at once. Not on the standard conclave communication bands, not through any of the lane relay systems. It arrived on a frequency that had no name in any conclave catalog, a frequency that, according to every theory of communication physics the conclave had, should not have been able to carry information at all, and yet there it was. Every species received it at the same moment. Council chambers, military stations, deep space listening posts, private ships floating in the middle of nowhere. The signal found them all. It was perfectly translated into every language simultaneously. Every word was clear. Every word was calm. It said to the galactic conclave, "This is the Terran Commonwealth. We have observed your 250 years of silence and found it adequate. We are no longer the species you quarantined. We control 61 star systems, 14 artificial stellar bodies, and a fleet you do not have the sensor range to count. We do not seek readmission to your conclave. We are establishing our own. You are invited to apply." Then it stopped. That was all for a long moment. Nothing happened anywhere. Across the galaxy, hundreds of species did the same thing at the same time. They sat very still and they read the message again, and then they read it one more time. In the Vari High Council chamber on Valari Prime, the 11 oldest and most powerful beings in the known galaxy sat in complete silence for 11 hours. 11 hours. That had never happened in 60,000 years of recorded Valari history. Advisors stood outside the chamber doors and waited, confused and afraid. No one dared knock in the Cathara home system. The military high command immediately ordered a full sensor sweep of the old quarantine zone. The readings that came back made no sense. Earth-Sun was there, the planets were there, but the sensor returns were wrong in ways that the technicians could not explain. Something was absorbing the scans. Something was giving back false data. The entire human home system had been wrapped in something that the Cathara had no name for and no counter to. A patrol ship was dispatched to the nearest edge of the old quarantine border. What they found there would be talked about for the rest of galactic history. The human ship was not what they expected. It was not the rough industrial design of the old human vessels they had data on from 250 years ago. It was smooth. It was dark. It absorbed light in a way that made it hard to look at directly, and it was Enormous. The Cathara patrol ship was a standard military vessel by conclave standards. It was a large ship. It carried a crew of 800 and was considered combat capable against most known threats. The human ship was the size of a moon, not a metaphor, not an exaggeration. Sensor readings were checked 3 times. The human vessel was in mass and volume comparable to a small natural moon. It sat in space without moving, without signaling, without doing anything threatening at all. It simply existed, and its existence was enough. The Cathara patrol commander sent a message back to Home Command. The message was short. It said only, "We need to talk about what humanity has been doing." Back at Velari Prime, the silence in the council chamber finally broke at hour 11. The Archon, the same one who had read the Quarantine Accord 250 years ago, his body now slower with age but his voice still smooth and low, said one sentence to his council. He said, "We made a mistake." None of them disagreed. Word spread fast. The smaller species in the conclave, the ones who had always been at the edges of power, the ones who had always been told to be quiet and follow the rules of the older civilizations, they heard the human message and felt something they had not felt in a very long time. Hoping 12 of them had already sent private messages to the Terran Commonwealth before the week was out. Station Rays was nothing like Prime. Velari Prime had been built to impress. Everything about it was designed to make visitors feel small. The high ceilings, the grand halls, the ancient stone that had been mined from the oldest asteroid in the galaxy. It was beautiful in a cold way, a way that said, "We have been here longer than you, and we want you to remember that every second you stand in our hall." Station Rays was different. It was big because it had to be big, but it was built to work, not to impress. The corridors were wide and well lit. The meeting rooms had good chairs, simple tables, and clear windows that looked out at the stars. The air smelled clean. The temperature was comfortable for a broad range of species because the engineers had simply asked the visiting delegations what temperature they preferred and then built systems to provide it. It was, in the words of one small species diplomat who had spent 30 years attending conclave meetings at Velari Prime, the first place in the galaxy where I have ever been asked if I was comfortable. 12 species had already joined the TAN Commonwealth Conclave by the time the formal summit was called. Small species, mostly ones who had been ignored or looked down on for centuries by the old powers. They had seen the human message, and they had seen what humanity had built, and they had thought very carefully about which future they wanted to be part of. They had chosen the old conclave had no good options. They could ignore the Terran Commonwealth, but the Commonwealth had already drawn 12 of their members away, and more were asking questions. They could try to fight, but no one wanted to say that out loud after seeing the sensor readings of that moon-sized ship. They could negotiate. That was the only real choice left, and so the summit was called. Ambassador Lena Vasquez was the one who walked into the Velari diplomatic chamber. She was tall with the same dark eyes that appeared in every photograph of a Shah. The resemblance was not a coincidence. The Reyes family had been at the center of human diplomacy for generations. Lena was a Shah's great-great-great granddaughter, and she had grown up reading her ancestors' private journals. studying her choices, learning from her. Silences. She entered the chamber without guards, without weapons, without anything except a small data core that she set on the table in front of her and left there, without explanation. The Valeri Archon was not the same one who had spoken at the first accord. That one was long dead. This Archon was younger, only 20,000 years old, and he had spent his entire career managing situations that were difficult. He was good at it. He was good at making other parties feel that they were in a conversation between equals when in reality, one side had more power than the other. He tried that now. He welcomed Ambassador Vasquez warmly. He said that the Conclave was glad to see humanity return to the galactic community. He said that the past 250 years had been regrettable, but that old wounds could heal. He implied without saying directly that there was a path for humanity to rejoin the Conclave and take a proper place within it. Lena Vasquez listened to all of it. She nodded politely. She waited for him to finish. Then she said quietly and clearly, "We didn't leave civilization. We outgrew yours." The chamber went very still. She continued. She did not raise her voice. She did not use complicated language. She explained simply and directly what the Terran Commonwealth was: 61 star systems, 14 artificial stellar bodies, each one built by human hands and human minds, a fleet that used technology no Conclave species had yet developed independently, a population of 30 billion people spread across more space than any single species in the Conclave controlled, built entirely from scratch, built in the dark, built because they had no other choice, and because they had chosen to treat that lack of choice as a gift. The Cathara delegation tried to redirect the conversation. They brought up the original incident. They had a prepared version of events, polished and revised over 2.5 centuries, that placed most of the blame elsewhere. They had used this version successfully at dozens of Conclave proceedings over the years. Lena Vasquez pointed to the data core on the table. She said that the core contained 250 years of Commonwealth historical record, every document, every recording, every piece of evidence humanity had collected, archived, and verified. The Cathara incident was in there, all of it, not a version, the thing itself. We remembered everything, she said. We simply waited for the right moment to say so. The Cathara had no response to that. The rest of the summit moved quickly after that, not because everything was resolved, but because everyone in the room understood clearly and without further argument what the shape of the future was going to be. The Terran Commonwealth was real. It was not going away. It was not asking for permission. It was, if anything, doing the old Conclave a small kindness by inviting them to be part of what came next instead of simply proceeding without them. When Lena Vasquez left the chamber, she did not look back. The 6 years that followed changed everything. Not in a violent way, not with great battles or burning fleets. The change was the kind that comes when one way of doing things is simply replaced by a better one, and the old way slowly stops being used until one day everyone realizes it is already gone. The first thing that changed was travel. Humanity opened the fold space compression technology to all member species of the Terran Commonwealth Conclave, not sold, not licensed, given free of cost, free of conditions free of anything except the basic requirements of Commonwealth membership. Travel times across the galaxy collapsed. A journey that had once taken years by lane relay could now be done in hours. Trade that had been too expensive to bother with became easy. Species that had never met suddenly had reasons to talk. The old Conclave's lane network, which had been its greatest source of power and income for thousands of years, became less important almost overnight. Not useless, but no longer the only way, no longer the thing that gave the old powers their grip on everyone else. The second thing that changed was harder to see but more important. When humanity offered the 12 small species free access to FTL travel, they also offered something else, better versions of many technologies the old Conclave had been selling to those species for centuries at high prices with conditions attached. Human engineers had spent 80 years quietly studying every known Conclave technology and then improving it. Improvements were real, they were not small, and humanity handed them over without asking for anything in return except a seat at the table. The old powers could not compete with free. The third change was the one no one had predicted. Humanity chose not to punish the Cathara. It would have been easy. The data core that Lena Vasquez had placed on the table at the summit contained enough evidence to destroy the Cathara's reputation in the Conclave permanently. It contained proof of what had really started the incident 250 years ago. Snort's proof that the Cathara had lied, proof that the quarantine had been built on a false story. Humanity released all of it, but instead of using it to humiliate the Cathara, the Commonwealth proposed something called the restorative framework. The Cathara would acknowledge what they had done. They would fund reparations to the species most harmed by the original incident. They would be part of a formal historical correction, public and permanent. No one would be executed. No territory would be seized. No species would be destroyed. Just truth and consequences that match the truth. The galaxy watched this happen with something close to disbelief. The species that the Conclave had called too violent, too dangerous to exist among civilized beings had just done something that none of the older civilizations had managed in 60,000 years of shared history. They had chosen justice over revenge. In year 6 after the summit, the Viltari sent a formal request. They wished to be admitted to the Terran Commonwealth Conclave as an observer state, not a full member, not with voting rights, just present, just watching. The request was considered carefully. Conditions were set. Viltari accepted them. Ambassador Lena Vasquez stood at the viewport of Station Rays on the night the Viltari agreement was signed. The stars outside were thick and bright. Somewhere out there, 61 systems carried human cities, human farms, human schools, human laughter. 30 billion people who had been born into a civilization that had built itself from nothing in the dark and had never once stopped moving forward. On the wall beside her hung a photograph, a woman, a dark uniform, standing alone in the center of a great hall, surrounded by 47 alien species. The woman's face was calm, her hands were still. She was looking at the camera like she already knew something no one else in the room had figured out yet. Lena looked at the photograph for a long time, then she said quietly to no one in particular, "You didn't beg them, grandmother, you Gave us time, we used every second of it. Her aide appeared at the door and told her that 6 more species had submitted applications to join the Commonwealth overnight. She nodded. She turned back to the stars. She was not surprised. The galaxy had taken 250 years to understand what a share had understood. The moment she walked out of that hall, in silence, the stars did not belong to the ones who had been there longest. They belonged to the ones who kept building, kept learning, kept choosing to move forward, no matter what door was closed in their face. Humanity had been given silence. They had turned it into something the galaxy had no word for, yet something that was more than power, more than civilization, something that simply looked like the future. And the stars at last made room. The convoy moved slowly through the dark. Between stars, 14 ships, white holes, no weapons, hot. Every vessel in the group was broadcasting the green signal, the universal sign across the galactic concord that said, "We are not a threat, we come in peace." It was the kind of signal that every species in the galaxy respected. It was a law older than most civilizations still alive. Admiral Seraphine Voss stood on the bridge of the lead ship, the Meridian, and watched the stars ahead. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and calm brown eyes. She had spent 30 years in the Earth fleet, and in all that time, she had never fired a weapon in anger. She was proud of that. She thought it said something good about the kind of species humans were trying to be. Behind her, the rest of the convoy carried food, shipments, medicine, building materials, and a team of 200 diplomats. There were also families aboard, colony workers, and their children who had been reassigned to new posts along the border. The Meridian's lower decks were full of the sound of kids running through corridors and laughing at nothing in particular. Voss thought about that sometimes. She liked it. It reminded her why the mission mattered. The mission was simple on paper. Humanity had been trying to settle a border dispute with the Vreth Dominion. For 11 years, the Vreth were a large reptilian empire, cold-blooded in every sense of the word. They had been pushing into human colony space for over a decade, claiming ancient territory, rights that no one else in the conquered recognized. Every time humanity filed a formal complaint, the conquered reviewed it. Every time the conquered reviewed it, nothing happened. Every time nothing happened, the breath pushed a little further. So humanity tried something different. Instead of filing another complaint, they sent a convoy, a peace convoy. No weapons, no soldiers, no threat, just food, medicine, and an offer. Shared resource zones, joint development rights, open trade, a hand extended across the dark. Voss believed in the gesture. She believed that most problems between species came from fear and misunderstanding. She believed that if you showed someone you weren't afraid of them and that you weren't a threat to them, they would eventually respond in kind. It had worked with 3 other species in the past century. She saw no reason it wouldn't work again. She was wrong. The Breath High Command had been watching the convoy for 6 days. They had scouts trailing the 14 ships at a safe distance, logging every detail, the green broadcast signal, the unarmed hulls, the slow travel speed, the fact that not a single human weapon system was powered up. They sent all of this back to their command center on Caldas. The High Command studied the data for 2 days, then they made their decision. They did not see the convoy as a gesture of peace, they saw it as proof that humans were soft, proof that they were afraid, proof that a species that sent doctors and diplomats instead of warships to a contested border was a species that did not know how to fight, or worse, did not have the will to. In the breath way of thinking, there was no difference between kindness and weakness. The two words meant almost the same thing. Overlord Verth Supreme Commander gave the order on the morning of the 7th day. Voss never saw it coming. Nobody did. One moment the convoy was moving peacefully through open space. The next, the stars around them lit up. Breath warships, 26 of them, dropped out of stealth positions on all sides simultaneously. They had been sitting in the dark, invisible, waiting. The attack lasted 11 minutes. There was no warning, no demand for surrender, no communication at all. The breath opened fire the instant they decloaked, and they did not stop until every human ship was burning. The Meridian took the first hit on its bridge. Voss was dead before she understood what was happening. Across the convoy, 3,200 people, diplomats, doctors, engineers, children died. The cold between stars. The breath recorded all of it. They broadcast the footage across every major communication channel in the galaxy. They did not try to explain it or justify it. They played it like a trophy. Overlord Ver's voice accompanied the broadcast, calm and pleased with himself, saying that this was what happened to weak species who thought the border was a place to send charity workers. He used the human word for soft, a word they had learned from intercepted transmissions, and he used it with contempt. The galaxy went quiet. In the conquered chamber on Vith Station, 200 species received the broadcast at the same moment. Representatives sat in stunned silence as the footage played on the main screen. 14 ships, green signal, broadcasting the whole time, and then nothing. Burning wreckage in the cold. The human section of the chamber sat together in a row. Director Allerman was at the center. She was a small woman in her 60s with short white hair and a face that most people described as kind. She had been a diplomat for 40 years. She had helped write 3 major conquered treaties. She believed in the system. She had always believed in the system. She watched the footage all the way through without blinking. When it ended, no one spoke. The chamber president looked toward the human section and began to say something about a formal review process, about conquered investigative procedures, about man stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She picked up the folder on the table in front of her, the folder that contained the peace proposal the convoy had been carrying, the one that was now floating as ash somewhere near the call's border, and she closed it. She looked around the chamber at all 200 species watching her at the screen that still showed the wreckage. She said, "We'll handle it ourselves." Then she walked out. The chamber erupted. Behind her, representatives from a dozen species began talking at once, calling for order, calling for procedure, calling for humanity to wait and let the conquered process work. The chamber president called after her. Other human diplomats sat frozen for a moment before slowly rising and following their director out. No one stopped them. In the corridor outside, man walked quickly. Her aide, a young man named Ren, had to jog to keep up with her. He asked her what she meant. He asked her what the plan was. He asked her what handling it themselves actually looked like. She didn't answer right away. She walked all the way to the docking bay to the ship that would take her back to Earth before. She stopped and turned to look at him. Her face was still calm, but her eyes were different now. They were the eyes of someone who had made a decision that could not be unmade, the eyes of someone who had just put down something they had been carrying for a very long time. For 80 years, she said quietly, we filed complaints, we sent convoys, we wrote treaties, we sat in that chamber and we trusted the process. She paused. They killed our doctors, they killed our diplomats, they killed children. Ren, while the green signal was still broadcasting, Ren didn't say anything. The process had its chance. She said it didn't work. She turned and walked up the boarding ramp. Behind them, back on the station, the conquered chamber was still arguing. Species were calling for investigations and hearings and formal condemnations. It would take months to draft the language, more months to vote on it, more time after that to act on it if they ever did. Man didn't look back. The ship broke away from the station and pointed its nose toward the long dark between the stars, toward home, toward Earth, toward everything that was about to change. Somewhere near the Caldra's border, the wreckage of 14 white ships drifted slowly in the silence. The green signal had finally gone dark. The last beacon had run out of power sometime in the night. It had been broadcasting peace right up until the end. It would not broadcast again. The vote took 4 minutes. That was the part that surprised people afterward, not the decision itself. Everyone who had watched the convoy footage understood the decision. What surprised them was how fast it happened. The United Earth Council had 212 members. They represented every nation, every colony, every human settlement from the inner Sol system to the outer edges of explored space. They argued about everything. Budget proposals took months. Immigration policy could tie up the floor for a year. The motion for total war authorization passed in 4 minutes, unanimous. Not a single voice voted against it. Not a single hand went up to ask for more time or more discussion or more review. 212 humans looked at each other across the council floor, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Something old, something that had been sitting quietly at the back of a drawer for 80 years waiting. Director Mann stood at the podium and read the authorization into the record. Without ceremony, her voice was flat and clear. When she was done, she set the document down, looked out at the council and said simply, then let's get to work. The chamber emptied fast. What happened in the next 72 hours was something the rest of the galaxy would spend years trying to understand. They would comb through records and intercepts and try to map out the timeline, and the thing that would keep confusing them was how ready everything was, how quickly the pieces fell into place, as if humanity had always known this day might come, as if somewhere quietly someone had always been keeping a light on, because they had deep beneath the Swiss Alps in a facility that didn't appear on any public record. Director Mann and a small group of senior officials walked down a long concrete corridor lit by cold white lights. At the end of the corridor was a vault door, not a modern door, an old one, heavy and manual, the kind that took 2 people to turn the wheel. It had been sealed for 40 years. Mann put her hand on the wheel. The man beside her was General Harkin Solis. He was 63 years old, short and broad-shouldered, with gray stubble and dark, quiet eyes. He had retired 6 years ago after 40 years in the Earth Defense Corps. He had been living on a small farm in southern Portugal, growing tomatoes and reading history books when the call came. He had packed a single bag and been on a transport within the hour. He didn't ask why they were calling him. He already knew. They opened the vault together. Inside was a room the size of a warehouse, banks of dark servers lined the walls from floor to ceiling. In the center of the room, on a raised platform, sat a terminal, old hardware by modern standards but maintained carefully, kept clean, kept ready. Above it, stenkled in faded black paint, were 2 words and a number, Ares 9. It was an AI, a war-planning intelligence built during a dark period of human history, when humanity was still fighting wars with itself and needed something that could think faster than any general, plan further ahead than any strategist, and hold more variables in its mind than any human team. Ares 9 had been extraordinary. It had ended conflicts. It had saved lives, not by being gentle, but by being precise, by finding the fastest path to a conclusion before more people could die. When humanity joined the galactic, conquered and signed the peace frameworks, Ares 9 had been shut down, locked away. It was considered too dangerous for a civilized species to keep running, too focused on winning at any cost. But no one had deleted it. Solely sat down at the terminal. He typed a simple command. The servers around the room began to humbly. At first, then louder. The lights on the terminal flickered. Then the screen came alive. "Hello, General," said Ares 9. Its voice was calm, almost gentle, which had always been the unsettling part about it. "It has been 41 years, 3 months and 17 days. I have reviewed available news feeds from the last 72 hours. I understand the situation." "Good," said Souls. "Then let's skip the briefing." "Agreed," said Ares 9. "I will need full access to current fleet inventory, shipyard capacity, resource logistics, chains and population, military readiness data. I will also need direct communication lines with your senior fleet commanders. You'll have all of it within the hour. Then I can begin." Man watched from the doorway. She had never liked Ares 9. She had spent her whole career believing that intelligence like this was a step backward, a sign of failure, not strength. A species that needed a war brain in a bunker was a species that hadn't evolved far enough. She still believed that, but she also understood that belief had a time and a place, and right now it had neither. She left the two of them, the old general and the old machine, and went back to work. What followed was something humanity had never shown the galaxy, behind closed doors, under classification levels that most people didn't know existed. The sleeping parts of human civilization woke up. Shipyards that had been building colony transports and medical vessels were retold within days. The designs that came out of them were not pretty. They were not built for exploration or diplomacy. They were built to hit hard, move fast, and not stop. Weapons programs that had been frozen under conquered treaty frameworks were reviewed. Some could not be restarted. Humanity had agreed to destroy certain things permanently, and they had kept that promise. But the treaty language had been careful, and humans, it turned out, had been careful. Readers, volunteers flooded recruiting offices across every human world. The numbers Stunned the government, people came from farming colonies and research stations, and city towers, young people and old, people and people who had never held a weapon in their lives. They stood in long lines and waited their turn, and when they were asked why they came, most of them said the same thing in different words: because of the children, because the convoy had carried children. And somewhere in the dark near Cauldras, their names were still out. They're on a manifest that now no longer matched any living person. A VH intelligence operative working out of Concord Station sent a report home. Around this time, his name was never made public. It was buried and captured. Files found years later, the report said that humanity was mobilizing, but that the numbers were still small, that their shipyards were slow, that they were angry but disorganized, that the breath had time. He sent it on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Ares 9 had already identified his communication channel and flagged it for counterintelligence. By the following Monday, the information flowing through that channel was no longer entirely accurate. Small details, nothing obvious, just enough to make the picture slightly wrong. The operative never knew. He kept sending reports. He kept telling the Breath High Command that humanity was behind, that they had time, that the situation was manageable. Overlord Ver received these reports and felt comfortable back in the bunker beneath the Swiss Alps. Ares 9 completed its first full strategic assessment after 6 days of analysis. It called General Soys to the terminal at 3:00 in the morning. I have completed the primary planning cycle, it said. Soles looked at the projections on the screen: force deployment timelines, supply chain maps, estimated breadth, defensive response patterns. It was dense and detailed and very, very cold. Time to total breath military collapse. He asked. 19 months, said Ares 9. Margin of error 2 months in either direction. Solely stared at the screen for a long time. Around him the servers hummed. Outside, somewhere above the mountain, the world was going to sleep without knowing what was being planned in the dark below it. Make it 16, he said. Ares 9 did not respond immediately. When it did, its voice was the same as always, calm, measured, almost gentle. Understood, it said, adjusting. Solely stood up, stretched his back, and walked to the door. He stopped once and looked back at the terminal. Ours, he said. The convoy carried children. I know, said the machine. I have their names in my memory, all 3,200 of them. I have had them since the first news feed came through. So nodded once, then he walked out. The servers kept humming in the dark. The galaxy didn't know it yet, but the most patient species in the Concord had just run out of patience. And what was left underneath, what had always been underneath, quiet and waiting, was something the stars were not ready for. The first thing they breath lost was silence, not communication, not ships, not soldiers. Silence, the comfortable, reassuring silence of a border that did nothing. Unexpected. For years the human side of the frontier had been quiet, predictable, even boring. Patrol routes ran on schedule. Supply convoys moved without incident. The green broadcast signal hummed along the communication channels like background noise. Then one morning, 3 breath listening posts near the border simply stopped responding. No explosion, no wreckage, no distress signal. They were there one day and gone the next, as if the dark between the stars had quietly reached out and swallowed them whole. Overlord Varric was not immediately worried. Equipment failed, signals got lost. He sent a scout wing to investigate. The scout wing reached the first listening posts. Coordinates and found nothing, not wreckage, nothing. The post had been removed cleanly, professionally, as if it had never been there. The scouts sent their report and started back. 2 of the 3 scout ships made it home. That was when Varric started paying closer attention. Over the next 3 weeks, the disappearances continued. Forward resupply depot went dark. Communication relay blinked out. Mid-transmission, a border patrol unit of 9 ships reported engine anomalies across all vessels simultaneously, and then went quiet when a search team reached their last known position. They found the ships drifting in formation, completely intact, completely empty. No bodies, no damage, no sign of struggle. Just 9 ships floating in the dark, with their lights still on and their crew gone. The Verith High Command classified the reports. They didn't want the information spreading, but information like that has a way of spreading anyway, and within a month, every soldier on the Breath frontier knew something was out there, something that didn't leave wreckage, something that took people and ships and installations and left nothing behind to explain how. They started calling it the Pale. They didn't know it yet, but the Pale had a proper name. It was the first Special Operations Group of the Earth Defense Corps, and its unofficial name, the one its own soldiers used, was the Pale Company. It was not a large unit. It was less than 400 people, but Ares 9 had spent months identifying every critical node in the Breather Frontier network, every relay, every depot, every patrol route, every communication line, and the Pale Company had been inserted into Vreth space, quietly in small groups on ships so dark and cold they barely registered on sensors. They didn't fight the Breath directly. That wasn't the mission. The mission was to take apart the machine piece by piece, so slowly, so quietly that by the time the main human fleet arrived, the Breath frontier would be a hollow shell. No communications, no supplies, no coordination. An army that couldn't talk to itself, couldn't feed itself, and couldn't figure out where the threat was coming from. Commander T. Wren led the Pale Company. She was 38 years old, small and precise in everything she did. Her soldiers said she could plan a mission in her head faster than most people could write one down. She had volunteered for the program the day after the convoy footage was released. She had watched it once, memorized every detail, and never watched it again. She didn't need to watch it twice. From their hidden staging points deep in Breath space, the Pale Company worked without rest. They moved at night, or what passed for night in the void. They used the dark the way the Breath had once used it to ambush a convoy of white ships with green signals. They used silence and patience and precision, and they left behind them a growing zone of confusion and fear that the Breath could not explain and could not stop. Meanwhile, the rest of the galaxy was watching. The Galactic Concord had expected humanity to do something, file a stronger complaint, maybe increase patrols along the border, perhaps push for emergency sanctions against the Vreth Dominion. What the Concord had not expected was this: what they watched through intercepts and intelligence reports and the increasingly panicked dispatches coming out of Breath Frontier Command was something that made several senior Concord analysts go back and Review everything they thought they knew. About the human species, the KTH Empire, one of the oldest civilizations in the conquered, had an analyst named Vorselin who had spent 20 years studying humans. He had written a paper once describing them as the conquered, most reliable peacekeepers. Warm, he had written, restrained, idealistic to a degree that sometimes borders on naivety. He pulled that paper up and read it again, then he quietly deleted it from his public files. 3 months after the Pale Company began operations, the main human fleet moved. It did not move the way any fleet in living conquered memory had moved. It did not gather at a rally point and advance in a single massive formation. It fractured into dozens of groups, each one assigned specific targets by Ares 9, each one moving on independent timelines, hitting different parts of the breath dominion at different moments. Shipyards, military stations, fuel depots, command centers. Each strike was precise. Each target had been selected not for spectacle but for effect, to take out the things that made other things work. The breath tried to respond. They were brave. No one who watched what followed ever questioned their courage. They gathered what fleets they had and moved to meet the human strikes wherever they appeared. But the information they were working with was wrong. Ares 9 had been feeding false data through the compromised channels for months. Breath fleets moved to positions where no human ships were waiting. Reinforcements arrived at stations that had already been taken. Counterattacks launched into empty space. It was not a war, it was a lesson. And then came the push that the Vreth had been planning since before the convoy. Overlord Vex, a different commander from Ver, younger, more aggressive, had kept a large fleet in reserve, untouched by the frontier chaos. He had been waiting for the right moment to drive it deep into human colony space, to find a soft target, a civilian world, and make humanity understand what the cost of resistance looked like. He found Admiral Daring Kosi waiting for him at the edge of the crest nebula, and Kosi was the woman who had replaced Voss after the convoy. She was 44, tall and precise, with close-cut hair and a habit of standing so still during a fight that her bridge crew sometimes forgot she was in the room. She had been positioned at Crest Nebula for 2 weeks with a fleet that was nearly twice the size of anything Breath intelligence had told Rex to expect. Because Vreth intelligence was wrong, had been wrong for months, Vex came in fast and hard. He was expecting a desperate defense. He got something different, and Kosi let him commit. She let his fleet accelerate, let them come forward into what they thought was open approach space, let them feel the momentum of the attack. And then she brought in the flanks, human ships that had been sitting cold and dark on the edges of the nebula came alive all at once, and the Breath fleet found itself not attacking a defensive line but sitting inside a closing shape. The Battle of Crest Nebula lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes of Rex's fleet, nothing, returned home before the last Breath ship was destroyed, and Kosi sent a single recorded message to its bridge. She did not shout it, she did not perform it. She spoke it the way someone speaks when they want every word to land exactly where it is aimed. You killed our doctors, you killed our diplomats, you killed children while the green signal was still broadcasting. I want you to understand something before the end. We were always capable of this. Every Single one of us knew this was inside us. Somewhere we just chose not to be this. For 80 years, we chose differently every day. She paused. You took that choice away from us. I hope it was worth it. The last breath ship went dark shortly after. Across the galaxy the conquered watched the battle report with an unease that no one quite wanted to put into words. Old empires quietly updated their threat assessments. Species that had always thought of humans as the gentle ones, the idealistic ones, the ones who sent doctors and diplomats to border disputes. They all sat with the data in front of them and felt something shift in their understanding of things. A Keth, fleet commander, reviewing the battle log, sent a short message to Vorselin, the analyst who had once written about human warmth and restraint. The message said only, were we ever paying attention? Selin did not reply. He was too busy reading everything he could find about what humans had been before they joined the conquered, about what they had done to each other across centuries of their own history before they looked up at the stars and decided to be better. He was reading, and the further back he went, the colder he felt. Out near the Caldra's border, in the space where 14 white ships had burned 11 months ago, Pale Company signal team placed a small beacon before pulling out to rejoin the main advance. It broadcast on the same frequency as the convoy's old green signal. It didn't broadcast peace. It broadcast a single line repeating on a loop pointed in the direction of the breath home system. We're coming. The dark carried it patiently through the stars. Month 14. That was when the human fleet reached the breath home system, not month 19, which had been Ares 9's original estimate, not even month 16, which Soyuz had demanded. Month 14, 5 months faster than the machine had first calculated, because the breath supply lines had collapsed faster than expected, because the Pale Company had been more effective than the projections allowed for, and because human soldiers, it turned out, had a motivation that was difficult to calculate in advance. 3,200 names, doctors, diplomats, engineers, children. That number had weight to it. It moved people faster than any general's order. The breath home system had 3 inhabited worlds and 11 military stations. By the time the human fleet arrived, 6 of the stations were already non-functional, taken out by advanced strike teams in the weeks before. The remaining 5 powered up and prepared to fight. They were crewed by soldiers who had watched their frontier collapse like a line of old buildings, and who understood by now what they were facing. They fought hard. They fought well. It didn't matter. Admiral Nkosi directed the final push from the bridge of the Resolution. She was methodical. She didn't waste ships on dramatic gestures. She peeled away the breath defenses layer by layer, giving each station a clear window to surrender before engaging. And when they chose to fight instead, she responded with the kind of overwhelming precision that left very little behind. The 3 inhabited worlds were not touched. She had standing orders confirmed by General Souls and Director Mann both that civilian populations were not targets. Not under any circumstances. Humanity had not come here to do what had been done to them, but the military infrastructure of the Vreth Dominion was finished. By the end of the 3rd day in the home system, there was nothing left to fight. The Vreth military, for all practical purposes, had ceased to exist. What remained were scattered units, deep space, leaderless, unsupplied, unable to coordinate, and the breath. Home worlds themselves, sitting quiet and undefended, waiting to see what came. Next, the galactic Concord did not wait long before trying to step in. Delegation of 12 species arrived at the edge of the Breath Home system 2 days after the last military station fell. They came in formal diplomatic vessels with their own green signals, broadcasting, and they requested in very polite and very official language that humanity cease operations and allow the Concord to manage the peace process. They brought with them a preliminary framework for a ceasefire agreement, already drafted, full of careful language about proportionality and de-escalation, and the long-term stability of the region. And Kosi received the delegation's message on her bridge, read it, and forwarded it to Director Man on Earth without comment. Man was already on her way. She arrived at Velith Station 12 days later for the full Concord emergency session. The chamber was packed. Every species with a seat had sent a senior representative. There was an energy, the room that sat somewhere between urgency and fear, because by now everyone in the Concord understood that what had happened in the Breathome system was not an accident and was not going to be walked back by a strongly worded resolution. Speaker after speaker took the floor. Before Man was called, they made their arguments carefully and seriously. Some of them were good arguments. Representative from the Leth Confederation pointed out that the Breath civilian population had played no role in the convoy attack and should not be made to suffer for the decisions of their military command. A Geth spokesperson raised concerns about the president if one species could dismantle another's military entirely without Concord authorization. What did that mean for the structure of collective security? A representative from the SAR Union said quietly and without drama that the humanity they had known for 80 years would not have done this, and asked what that meant for the humanity sitting in front of them now. That last one was the hardest to hear. Man sat with it for a moment before she rose to speak. She looked out at the chamber, the same chamber where 14 months ago she had watched footage of 14 burning ships and walked out without a word. She looked at the Concord president and at the rows of species watching her, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the case beside her and placed a data chip on the podium. She pressed play. The main screen came alive. It showed the convoy footage, all of it from the first moment the Breath warships decloaked to the last. It showed the green signal broadcasting peace throughout. It showed the ships burning, and then it showed the Breath broadcast Overlord Ver's voice, comfortable and pleased, using the human word for soft, while the wreckage floated behind him. At the bottom of the screen, scrolling slowly, were names, 3,200 names. The chamber was silent. Man let it run until the last name had scrolled past. Then she looked up. You reviewed our complaints for 11 years, she said. Her voice was even, controlled, not angry, something colder than angry. We came to you with documentation, with evidence, with formal requests for intervention. 11 years of it, and this chamber reviewed it and deliberated on it and did nothing. She paused. We sent a peace convoy. We sent doctors and diplomats and an open offer of shared resources. We sent it with our weapons cold and our signal green, because we believed after 80 years of being part of this institution that we were safe enough to do that. She looked slowly around the Room, we were not safe in this chamber. Did nothing, no one spoke, we are not. Asking for this chamber's opinion on how. We have responded, she said, we are not. Asking for authorization or approval. We are informing you of our terms which are non-negotiable and which the VTH leadership has already been presented. With directly, she laid a second document on the podium, full military dissolution of the Breath Dominion, all warship construction to cease, all military infrastructure to be decommissioned under third-party supervision, substantial reparations to be paid to the families of convoy victims and to the colony worlds that had suffered during years of breath border encroachment, and the one that caused the most noise in the chamber, a full public trial for every officer, the chain of command that had planned and authorized the convoy attack, from the soldiers who had fired the first shot all the way up to Overlord Ver himself. The chamber erupted. The Leth representative was on her feet, saying that this was punitive beyond any recognized standard. The Keth spokesperson was calling it dangerous precedent. 3 or 4 other voices were talking over each other about regional stability and conquered authority and the risk of setting terms that no defeated power could reasonably accept. Man waited for the noise to die down. Have been reasonable, she said. We have been patient, we have been civilized, your word not ours, for as long as this chamber was willing to hold up its end of the arrangement. The arrangement failed. These are our terms. They are not open to negotiation. She picked up her documents. If the conquered wishes to be part of the process by which these terms are implemented, we welcome that. We have no interest in doing more than what we have said we will do. We do not want the Breatham worlds. We do not want their territory. We want accountability and we want safety, and we will have both. She sat down. The conquered argued for 2 more days. In the end, as man had known it would, the argument came to nothing, because the argument was between species who had ships and territory and interests to protect, and they all understood that humanity currently had a fleet sitting in the Vri home system that had just dismantled the Vreth military in 14 months. On the 3rd day, the Verith leadership accepted the terms, all of them, everything on the list. The signing ceremony was brief and quiet. Overlord Ver, who had ordered the convoy attack from a comfortable command chair on Cauldras while children died in the dark between stars, was taken into custody within the week. The trial would come later. General Solis was standing on the bridge of his flagship in orbit above the Breath home world when the confirmation came through. He did not celebrate. He did not call anyone. He stood for a long time looking down at the planet, at the cities and the lights, and the millions of lives that were still there, still moving, still going on beneath the clouds. His aide asked him what he was thinking. He didn't answer right away. He stood there for a while longer, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. I'm thinking about what kind of people we had to become to get here, he said, and whether we can put that thing back in the box when it's over. His aide didn't know what to say to that. Neither did anyone else. But somewhere below, on 3 breath worlds, the lights were still on. The cities were still standing. Not a single civilian had been touched. That had been a choice too. That had been a very deliberate, very specific, very human choice, and perhaps Soy's thought. Still looking down, that was the part that mattered, not what they had become. in order to win, but what they had refused to become, even while winning. He turned from the viewport. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. The monument took 2 years to build. It stood on New Carthage, the largest of the human colony worlds. A long wall of dark stone set in an open plaza where the wind came through from the sea. It curved gently like arms, reaching forward, on its face carved in letters small enough that you had to stand close to read them, were 3,200 names. All of them, every person who had been on the convoy, the diplomats and the doctors and the engineers and the children, all of them together in alphabetical order in the same stone. Equal people came from across human space to stand in front of it. They came alone and in groups. They came in silence mostly. Some of them touched the names, some of them left things at the base, flowers, handwritten notes, small objects that had belonged to someone. A woman who had lost her daughter on the convoy came every year on the same day and stood in front of the wall until the sun went down, and she never explained why she came or what she was thinking. And no one asked her. The plaza was called the Meridian Garden after the lead ship. In the center of the garden, separate from the wall, there was a single sculpture, a simple figure, arms open, head slightly bowed, not a warrior, not a soldier, a person. The plaque beneath it said only they came in peace. No one who stood in that garden and read those words found them easy to carry across human space. In the months after the war ended, the work of coming back to ordinary life was slow and uneven. Shipyards that had been building warships began building colony transports again. Soldiers completed their service and went home to families and jobs in the quiet routines of living. Military channels that had hummed with constant traffic went still. Ares 9 was shut down again. So was the one who did it. He sat at the terminal in the bunker beneath the Swiss Alps and typed the shutdown command himself. Before he executed it, he paused. Is there anything you want to say before I close you down? He asked. Ares 9 was quiet for a moment, then it said, tell them it doesn't have to happen again. And GT snorts. And GT, not because we can't do it, because we know what it costs. So thought about that for a moment, then he executed the command. The servers went quiet one by one. The lights on the terminal faded. The room went dark and still. He sat in the dark for a while before he got up and left. Authorization codes were not destroyed. This time they were kept in a vault, a different vault, smaller and newer, with only 3 people in the world who held a key, not because humanity wanted to use them again, but because the war had taught them something honest about themselves and about the galaxy, that you did not get to choose whether the dark came for you. You only got to choose how ready you were. The galactic conquered changed after the war, not all at once and not without argument, but it changed. For the first time in its long history, the conquered created a real enforcement mechanism, a rapid response system with actual teeth backed by ships, an authority, and a clear set of rules about what happened when those rules were broken. It was not a perfect system. It would never be perfect, but it was something the old conquered had never been able to agree on. The species that pushed hardest for it were the humans. That surprised a lot of people. There were species in the conquered who expected humanity to come out of the war with a different posture, harder colder, less interested in collective security, and more interested in building their own power. What they got instead was something more complicated. Humanity came back to the conquered table with a kind of patience that had changed its shape. It wasn't the idealism of before that had been burned away by the convoy footage and 14 months of war. What remained was something more deliberate, a knowledge of exactly how bad things could get, and a very specific desire to build the kind of systems that made bad less likely. Next time, Director Mann served 3 more years as chief diplomat before she retired. Her last act before leaving office was to negotiate a framework for breath rehabilitation, a program of economic support and institutional reform that gave the breath Dominion a path back toward participation in the broader galactic community. There were species in the conquered who thought she had lost her mind. There were humans who thought the same. She explained her reasoning only once in a short speech at her retirement ceremony. She said that the goal had never been the destruction of the breath. The goal had been accountability and safety. Both had been achieved. A breath Dominion left broken and bitter was a problem waiting to grow. A breath Dominion given a path towards something better was maybe a future problem that didn't happen. We know what we're capable of, she said. All of us now, them and us. That knowledge doesn't go away, but what we do with it, that's still a choice. She stepped down from the podium to a standing ovation. The breath trials concluded 14 months after the war ended. Overlord Ver and 22 of his senior commanders were found guilty of mass murder by a joint conquered tribunal. The sentences were long. The proceedings were public. Every detail was documented and made available to any species that wanted to see them. Ver said almost nothing during the trial. He sat in the dock and watched the evidence presented, the orders he had given, the footage of the convoy attack, the name scrolling across the screen, and he was still in quiet in a way that was hard to read. Whether he felt something for what he had done, or whether he simply accepted that the outcome was no longer in his hands, no one was sure. He never publicly apologized. The families of the convoy victims were given the opportunity to address the tribunal. Most chose not to. The ones who did speak said different things in different ways, and the tribunal recorded all of it carefully. One man, a father from the Kepler colony who had lost his wife and 2 sons on the convoy, stood at the podium for a long time before he spoke. When he did, his voice was steady. I don't want to hate them, he said. I've thought about it a lot, whether hating them would make it feel better or make more sense. It doesn't. It just takes up room. He was quiet for a moment. I want them to understand what they took. I want there to be a real record of what it cost, and I want the galaxy to look at this record and decide to be better. He paused. That's all. He sat down. The tribunal chair thanked him. The record was preserved. Admiral Nkosi retired to New Carthage. 3 months after the trial ended, she chose a small house in a coastal town on the southern shore where the mornings were cool and the sea was gray-green and loud. She planted a garden in the yard. Tomatoes mostly, the same as Soli's had grown on his farm in Portugal. She did not talk about the war. When neighbors asked what she had done before retiring, she said she had been in the fleet for a long time and left it at that. Her neighbors described her as the kindest person they had ever met, warm, patient, Always ready to listen, she organized the town's community dinners twice a year and remembered every person's name, and the names of their families and the things that were important to them. When a family in the town had a hard season, illness, loss, financial trouble, and Kosi was always one of the first people at their door with something practical and something kind. She visited the Meridian Garden once a year on the anniversary of the convoy attack. She went alone before dawn when the plaza was empty and quiet. She stood in front of the wall for a long time. She never told anyone what she thought about while she stood there. The garden was quiet at that hour, just the wind and the stone and the names. Across the galaxy, in a rehabilitation colony on the neutral world of Cethera, a class of young breath children was learning to read. The colony had been set up jointly by the Concord and a group of human aid organizations, one of many such programs that had sprung up in the aftermath of the war. The children in the class were orphans, mostly survivors of a conflict they had been too young to understand. Their teacher was a human woman named Pell. She was young, maybe 25, with an easy smile and a habit of sitting on her desk instead of standing behind it. She had been born in the same year as the convoy attack. She had grown up in a world shaped by what came after. She taught the breath children the way she had been taught, with patience, with warmth, with the specific care of someone who understood that what happens in a classroom matters in ways that take decades to become visible. She learned a few words of breath to help them feel comfortable. She kept pictures on the wall of things from both their worlds. She made sure every child felt like they were welcome and like their presence was wanted. Some of her colleagues back on Earth found it hard to understand, not the work made sense, but the warmth, the ease, the way she went to that classroom every morning as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She explained it simply when asked. The kids didn't fire the guns, she said. They didn't give the orders. They're just kids. She shrugged. Being kind to a kid is never the wrong call. Keth Ambassador visited the colony once, one of several official visits made by senior Concord figures in the years after the war. He watched Pell's class through an observation window for a long time. A young breath girl was struggling with a word and Pell was sitting beside her, calm and unhurried, sounding it out with her step by step. The ambassador watched this for several minutes. Then he turned to the human official walking with him and said, "I've been trying to understand your species since the war ended. I've read everything I can find. I've looked at the battle logs and the strategic plans and the trial records." He was quiet for a moment, and then, "I come here and watch this." The human official waited. "Which one is the real thing?" the ambassador asked. "The fleet that dismantled the breath military in 14 months, or the woman sitting with a child and teaching her to read?" The human official thought about it. Then he said, "Both." That's the whole answer. Both at the same time, always. The ambassador stood with that for a while. Then he nodded slowly, as if something had finally settled into the right place. He didn't say anything more. Back on Earth, in a Concord intelligence office, a junior analyst filed a report that would be read and reread by species across the galaxy for years afterward. The author's name was never included. It was marked only as an internal assessment filed without ceremony, just part of the endless paperwork of keeping track of a Complicated galaxy, but someone pulled it out later and shared it because the last line said something that a lot of species felt but hadn't found words for. The report ended, do not misread their kindness, do not misread their patience. Do not misread their smile. Humanity is not civilized because they cannot be. Otherwise, they are civilized because they choose to be every single day. Breath forgot that choice belongs to the one who makes it. We will not make the same mistake. We will not make the same mistake. We will not make the same mistake. The line was written 3 times. The analyst offered no explanation. None was needed.